Now we begin Daf Nun Ches. Haru'uyim likarev minayin. When you have something that's chulin, and had it been sanctified and designated for the mizbeach, it's royal mizbeach. Minayin l'rabos bali mumin. But how do you know that iser of shechting something that's chulin out and should be shechted outside the azor? You're not allowed to shecht in the azor. If you did so, it's also b'achila. How do we know that applies even to bali mumin that was shechted in the azor, which were never royally carved al mizbeach? And the Gemara answers again the logic that we saw in Daf Nun Zayin: Mar bani bali mumim shekei min hamachshir. Uminay l'rabba sachaya, mar bani sachaya shehi b'shchita kebeim. Minay l'rabba sa'ofos tavedlo mishchato v'shachato so v'shachato so, and we have extra psukim. So up until now, just to summarize, we've derived two conclusions. Number one, that it's asur to shecht chulin ba'azara, and that includes even bali mumim and even a chay and an ov. And number two, we derived that if he went ahead and he shechted chulin in the azar, it's asur b'achila. Yachal, the Brisa continues, lo yishcha v'yim shachad yashlich chenu lifnei klov. He's not allowed to eat it, but maybe he could feed his dog. How do we know that chulin shenishchatu b'azara asur b'ana? Talmud Lomar, the Brisa derives it from a miut in the oso, in the pasuk lakel tashlichin oso. Oso atomashlich hakelev ve'i atomashlich chulin shenishchatu be'azara. Now Rashi here has a whole discussion about this miut oso that's being mamayit basar chulin shenishchatu be'azara. Maybe it's being mamayit other basar. But the answer is, says Rashi, it says ubasar basada treifa. That's basar. That's yotzei chutz mechisaso. That's called treifa. And we're going to interpret it as galui kesada she'en lo mechitza. No mechitzos. It's like a sada that doesn't have mechitzos. Basar basada treifa. And then, since it doesn't have mechitzos like kelev tashlich and oso, and that means that since the basar is also b'achila because it was yatsa chutz lemechitzoso, then also tashlichun like kelev. But in another case of yatsa mi mechitzoso, ein lahashlich like kelev. What's another situation other than treifa, where it's yatsa chutz mechitzaso, that's chulin bazar, that the mechitza for chulin is chutz lazar, and it's also because he took the chulin into the azara chutz lemechitzas. The Gemara tells us the following: Ashkechinu mar Yehuda l'Rav Yosef l'Rav Shmuel brei de Rabba bar Rav bar Chana davu kaima pischa de bei Rabba. They were standing at the Pesach of the house of Rabbi. Amalahu. Rabbi Yehuda turns to them and he says, Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Makadesh bepeter chamar bebasa bechol bechun shenishlu bazar of Shimon omer kudeshes. Chacham omer eina mekudeshes. So we see that according to Rav Shimon, the Kiddushin is valid. There's no Isur Hana, at least on a Doraisa level. All the Isur Hana that could apply to the following Peter Chamor, Basa, Bechal, Chul, is all the Rabban. Alma says, my Yehuda, Chulin Shenishku Bazar, the Rab Shimon, Lav Doraisa. There's no Isra Anam in Torah. It's only a Gezerah the Rabbanan. They shouldn't be benefiting from Chulin that was Nishchat Bazara. The Rabbanan were Choshesh that maybe the spectators would mistakenly think that which he shechted in Azara were kodshim shenifsalu, and that's why he wasn't able to eat the basar. They don't know it's chulin bazara. They think it's kodshim shenifsalu, and there was never a zrikas dam, and there was never a matter to eat the basar, but it's mutarana. and they're going to come to have hana from Kodshim Psulim, and Kodshim Psulim are also hana. Therefore, Reb Shimon says that although midoraisa it's mutar hana, and therefore the Kiddushin is valid, midorabanan it's also hana. And here Tosfos asks the famous kasha from the Gemara in Psachim. The Gemara says Amarav Hamakadish Bechiti Kurdenaisa, which is chametz derabanan eina mekudeshes. And Tosfos answers that there he was Makadish and Ishon Erev Pesach after Shah Shishis. And Chametz Gamur is awesome in a Torah. And since this Chametz, Chiti Kurdenaisa, which is Chametz Nuksha, has its sad to be awesome in a Torah at that time, therefore Eina Mekudeshes, even though it's awesome in Rabbanan. But Chulin Shanishketu Bazar, according to Reb Shimon, ain't bo klal isum in a Torah. And therefore, even on the Rabbanan level, it means just a separate Isur Gzeir the Rabbanan. Frek the Gemara, this is Mar Yehuda Raminu. I'll ask you a kasha from a Mishnah in Tmura. Rabbi Shimon Omer Chulin Shenishketu Bazar Yisarfu V'chein Chaya Shenishketu Bazar Bisreifa. Now, if according to Rabbi Shimon, these cases of Chulin Shenishketu Bazar Mutar Ba'ana Midoraisa, why is it Sreifa? Why does it require Sreifa? It would seem that Rabbi Shimon requires Sreifa in the Mishnah in Tmura because he holds that there's an Isur Hana min HaTorah. The Rabbanan were Machmir, and they required Sreifa like Kodshim Psulim, and not Kvura like other Isur Hana, and that's the Sugya in Tmura, because they were choshesh that if he's going to bury them, the roim will make a mistake and think that Kodshim Psulim is dinam li cover, whereas in Kodshim Psulim it's dinam li saret. Now, if we're going to assume that Rabbi Shimon holds that the Isur is only the Rabbanan, why would the Rabbanan be machmir? Like, for example, let's take the case of a chaya. The chaya was nishkata bazara. Lo yitu aroim, and nevertheless, since it's asur min HaTorah, therefore they were mashved dinam to shar chulin shenishkatu bazar and tisaret, get it to din sreifa. In the case of behemas chulin, they made a gzera atu kodshim psulim that not sufficient to do kvura, but you need sreifa. But in the case of chaya, the whole gzera is not shaya. Because we're not going to be makriv them in the Azorah. They're not going to make a mistake to be machlif beinom levein kodshim. So if min HaTorah muteres, and there's no chash sheyitu aroim, why is there a din of sreifa? Ishtaku, and they didn't have an answer to that question. However, asu lekami de Rabba, when they presented the question to Rabba, this kasha of Mar Yehuda, Amalu Rabba responded, Palgi uk minchu. Whoa, Katron. He was a katron, a kantron. This is not a kush at all. So we're talking about a case where a man was makadesh bechulin shenishketu bazara, and at the time of the shechita of the behemas chulin bazara, we didn't know it was treifa. We found out later that it was treifa. Rabbi Shimon holds this basar is not asur b'ana. That's why the Kiddushin is chal. And that's l'taimei. He's very consistent. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, shochet is a treifa. And we have to analyze whether it was a treifa before the shechita. The kein hashochet v'nimtzais treifa. Any time that we shecht and we find after the shechita it's a treifa, let's say b'nei be'ayin, zeh v'zeh chulin bazar. This is a case of a violation of shechitas chulin bazar. Rav Shimon matir bano. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon holds this is not shechita of chulin bazara, because since it's treifa, it's what's called a shechita sheina ru'uya, And a shchita she'ena ruya lav shmei shchita, and therefore it's not a case of nishchetu chulin bazar. Hence, it's mutar ba'noah. The Chachamim, on the other hand, hold that there was a ma'aser shchita, albeit of a treifa, and it's an ena ru'uya, but nevertheless, it's a ma'aser shchita. So even though amakarish b'chulin shenishtu bazara is mekudeshes, that's dafka the case of chulin shenitrafu, which according to Rav Shimon are mutar ba'noah, and that's why the Kiddushin is valid. But if it wasn't chulin shenitrafu, but rather it was a shchita re'uya, then Rabbi Shimon would concede that it's awesome in a Torah, even ba'noah, and therefore the Kiddushin would not be valid. The Mishnah says, Mecharan, if he sells Iser Hana, V'kidesh b'dmeim, and the money he got as payment for Iser Hana, which was illegitimate, that money he gave to a woman and he said, Arei Mekudeshes, Mekudesh, Minolan. How do we know that the Iser is not Nitfas b'domin? And therefore it's Mutar ba'noah. And the answer is, Midagoli, Rachmana, Bavodas Kachavim, etc., is Mechlal the Kol Isur Shv'Torah Shor. In Avodas Kochavim, the Torah says in Dvar Perek Zayin Vayisa Cherem Kamo, and we dash in the word Vayisa Kol Shata Mahayimena. In other words, anything that's from Avodah Zarah is also, even if it's from Mahaya Heimena. Let's say it's a chilufin of Avodah Zarah for something else. Harehu kamo, the muchlaf, which replaces in an exchangement for the Avodah Zarah, has the same din as the Avodah Zarah itself, and it's also ba'noah. But dafkin Avodah Zarah, that's where the din is that the machlif, the muchlaf is also is kamo. Mechlal, however, v'chol isur shebetorah sharu. Why don't you derive from Avodah Zarah that just like in Avodah Zarah, the damim are mutar are asurim. So to in all Isurei I know that was sold the damim are asurim. And the Gemara answers Mishum Davi Avodas Kacham Ushvi Shnei Ksuva Bam Kech. V'chol Shnei Ksuva Bam Kech Melamd. According to this Mandion. And now we're going to see Avodas Kacham Ad Amar, and it says Vayisa Cherem Kamo. And Shvius, how do we know that Shvius is Tofes as Domer? If you sell Shvius, Maihi. And we derive it from the Pasuk in Vayikra Chaf Hey, Parshas Emor, it says, Yovel Hi Kodesh Tia Lachem. The pairs of Shvius are called Kodesh. And from this analogy between pairs, Shvius and Kodesh, my Kodesh Tofes as Domav. If you sell Kodesh, the Domim become also like the Kodesh. Av Shvius Tofeses Domer. If you sell Shvius, then the Domim that you receive in payment, exchange for the Shvius, becomes also just like we saw in Kodesh. Fekti Gemara, I ma Kodesh Tofes es Domer. The Yotzei Lechulin is Av Shvius Tofes es Domer. The Yotzei Lechulin. You've already established Tfisas Domim in Shvius as you derive from Kodesh. So why not go a step further and derive that Hiatzma Yotzei Lechulin? That Hafkas Kedusha Shvius from the pairs that was sold is a direct result of the sale and the Tfisas Domim. Talmud Lomer on that, the Torah says, Tia Bavayasa Tia, that the Kedushas HaPeiros is not Mufka, even if these pairs were sold. They rather retain Havayasam, Nishari Bavayasam, Kiddushim Kifishoyim. Ketzad, what's a case of Peiros Shvius Shetovsim Es Domeim, but they themselves, Nisharim B'Kedushasam, Lokach B'Peiros Shvius Basar. He made a swap exchange, and he received basar for Peiros Shvius. Elu mispara b'Shvius. There's tfisas kedushas Peiros, not only on the Peiros but also on the basar, and that generates a chiv bir Peiros at the time of bir. Shekol achayim and ason. The basar, let's say the mocher went ahead and he bought meat. I'm sorry, v'kana ba basar dogim. So again, the mocher. So I'm getting confused there between the mocher and lokech. Just 1 second. The mocher received basar in payment for shvius that he sold to the lokech. Now the mocher takes that basar that was tofes damim and he buys dagim. Is yotza basar v'nichlesu dagim. At this point, the basar loses its kedusha, and the dagim replace the basar with kedusha shvius. Now, the kedusha shvius is on the dagim, and the mocher went ahead and he sold dagim for yayin. Yotzu dagim v'nichlesu yayin. Yayin shemen yotza yayin v'nichnas shemen. Ha'ketzed achron nitfas b'shvius. So the very last one in this whole Chad Gadya, in this domino, that's going to have Kedusha Shvius. In addition, Uperi Atzma Osir. The Peri Shvius themselves remain with their status of Osir Ba'na after the Zman Bir, because the Peri is not Yotze Michlal Kedushos. And that we derived before from Tia Bavayosa Tia. Gemara Yosefan Kasha Nicha Leman Di Omar Ein Shnei Ksuvim Abam Kechrei Melamdin Elaman Di Or Melamdin Ma'ikala Meimar. Why don't we derive from Avodah Zarah and Shvius for all other Isurim universally? And just like in Avodah Zarah and Shvius, the Me'am Asur Ba'na, so too in all Isuri Anov, the Me'am Asur Ba'na. And the Gemara answers, Mi'ute Ksive. We have a mute. Why? Ksiv Hachan Avodah Zarah, it says Ki Cherem Hu. Uksiv Hasam in Shvius, it says Yovel He. And these two words, Hu and He, are Mi'ute. He, meaning Avodah Zarah and Shvius. In, it's Tofes David. Midiachrini Lo. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Nun Ches. And this is a case of man who's Makadish B'Truma U'Maser. Now in Truma Maser, there are two different dinim. If the Truma is in the possession of a Kohen, then he can eat it, and his wife can eat it, and so forth. If on the other hand it's in possession of a Zar, then he has what's called Tovas Hanoah, and he can choose which Kohen he wants to give it to. So Makadish B'Trumos, a man took Truma, Gedola, Trumas Maser, it doesn't make a difference. And he was Makadish and Isha with Truma, or alternatively, B'Masros, Maser Rishon, which is given to the Levi, B'Matonos, that's Ro L'Chayim V'Keva, that are given to Kohanim from every Behemas Chulin, U'B'Mechatos, that's the mayim that was used for the concoction of Ephar Para Duma, and when Mazal the Tomi Mes Lataro, the Ephar Chatos. This is the Ephar itself of the Paraduma after the Sreifa. Harei Zuma Kudeshes. Vafilu Yisrael. Even though he's not a Kohen, but he has Tovas Hanoah. And if he gives it over to the Isha for Kiddushin, then she gains that Tovas Hanoah. Omar Ula derives from our Mishnah, Tovas Hanoah. No, I'm sorry. The Gemara is going to ask a kasha on our Mishnah against Ula. Ula holds that Tovas Hanoah ain't no mom. Esve Rabbi Abba Ula Hamakadesh B'Trumos V'Mas Matonos B'Mei Chatos B'Efer Pora Harezim V'Kudeshes Hafilu Yisrael. The Mishnah says explicitly, even Yisrael could be Makadesh with Trumos and Masros. What does he have? He's a Zar. He has Tovas Hanoah. So you see the Tovas Hanoah Momon Omerle Ula responds to Rabbi Abba's objection. Hacha b'Yisrael shenaflu lo tvolim mi beis havi Abba Kohen. When the Mishnah says Harezu Mekudeshes, has nothing to do with Tovas Hana. The Mishnah is talking about a case of Yisrael who inherited Birusha Tevel. That means Peros before the Hafroshes Truma U'Maser. Beis Havi Imo, from his maternal grandfather, who is a Kohen. His mother is a Bas Kohen. Because this Tana of our Mishnah holds, Matano Shelo Hurmu Kemisha Hurmu Dami. That even though what you have here technically is Tevel, it's before the Hafroshes Maser, but it's as if the Truma was removed. And the Kohen could be Zoche even before the Hafroshes Truma, because they're Nigmara Melachton V'Omdos Letera. So since his grandfather on his mother's side is a Kohen, and he was Zoche in this Truma by inheriting his grandfather, and that was before Hafrosha, the grandson who inherited was Zoche in the Truma, and he could sell it to Kohen. Even though, as a general rule, Tovas Hana Eino Mamon, but in this case, he inherited Tevel, and it's Kamisha Hurmadami, and therefore it's like Truma, even though he wasn't mafresh to Truma yet. It's before that Frasha, but nevertheless he has a full-fledged Zechia and possession and ownership of the Truma. Boy, Minei Rav Chia bar Ovin me Rav Huna. Tovas Hana Momano Eino Moman. Amalei, so Rav Huna responds to Nisua, let's derive it from our Mishnah. Amakadish Betrumas Umasus Umatonos Umechatus Ve'efrapor. Areiz Mukudesh Afilu Yisrael. So you see that in Isha's Miskadeshes, with Trumos and Masros that were given to her by Yisrael, it must be because Tovas Hana Mama. Amalei. So Rav Chia responds to Rav Huna V'lavo Kimna B'Yisrael Shenaflo Tfolim in Beis Havi Imo Kohen, and the reason why the Kiddushin is valid has nothing in the world to do with Tovas Hana Mamon, but because Matonish Lo Hurmu Harei Hein Kibisha Hurmu. And now we turn to Daf Nun Ches Amid Beis.